Thank you all for coming, and I hope that you'll decide at the end of this that it was worthwhile.
You know, I have to admit to this audience that Charles and I are friends, and that's both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that I know him, so I'll know when he's not telling the truth. And the disadvantage is that I may not be asking the tough questions, so I put him on notice to kind of hold me to make sure that the tough questions are asked. So let me start with Charles. Firstly, I love being with you, always, but especially this evening here. I read the book. There were times during the book that I just, oh my God, it took my breath away. It is one of the most unusual non-self-referential books, memoirs I've read. So tell me how it came to be written. How did you make the decisions as to at what level of honesty you were going to tell the story? And
well, I think perhaps when I read Michael Steinhardt's book, No Bull, that sort of inspired me, because Michael was very tough on himself. And I said to myself, as I'm a lot older than he was when he wrote his book, I said, heck, I'm 85 years old, and if I can't tell the truth now, when am I going to tell it? So I decided I would tell it as it is, no holds barred.
Did you get any feedback from members of your family?
From my own family, yeah, they thought it was good. My wonderful wife thought it was great.
Well, your wonderful wife is great.
She is. So is yours.
Thank you. At least we can go home with you safely tonight. Yeah.
But, my kids thought it was a very good read, but I wrote it for my grandchildren. Because I wanted them one day to really know who their pops, which is what I call it, who their pops is. And I said, you've got to write something that is really truthful. And like all families, there are family discussions and family angst and sibling rivalries and Lord knows what. But I think the major thing was, how does a young man, the fourth of four children, who is not very healthy and not very wise, how does he, and has no ego, and thinks that his siblings are much better than he is, how does he deal with life over time? And Peter, I was a late bloomer, and I had a very tough go when I was young.
Well, when you actually talk a lot about your youth and some of the challenges and problems you had health-wise, but also when going to school and being a shy child, tell us about your family. And one of the things you make clear is that it's not always easy to grow up with a family with money, and that in some way that was both an asset and a challenge for you. So tell us a bit about that childhood of yours.
Well, I didn't quite understand the money thing. There's a lot of things I think I didn't understand. We lived in this big house, and I had friends at school who lived in small houses. That didn't seem to impress me one way or the other. And we had a chauffeur and a car and all that sort of, all the accoutrements. My problem was I didn't think much of myself. I had my older sister got gold stars throughout school. My number two sister was an artist, a sculptor, and a tomboy, and she wouldn't be messed with. My brother was bigger and sort of a bully, and then there was me. Now, I worked out ways to get him in trouble, but as all young kids do when they're confronted with that sort of thing. But I really had no decent view of myself, because they come home with all these great marks, and I come home staggering. And I remember one time when I was still in grammar school, I went to sit in the section where the prize winners were, and the teacher a teacher said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I think I'll win the neatness prize." Not true. Didn't happen.
Was there a neatness prize?
Was there any what?
Was there a neatness prize?
There was.
And you didn't win it?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's life.
But you tell a story about how once you and Edgar were on a streetcar on your way to watch the hockey Montreal Canadiens, and he and you used to bet. And he bet against Montreal.
Right.
And you asked him how could he possibly do it, bet against his own team. And he pointed to his wallet and he said, the brain, and the wallet are connected, and you said something about, well,
he said that what happens here does not happen here.
Right.
The wallet and the heart are not connected.
So and
I couldn't handle that because they were very connected to me.
Yeah. So tell us about that. I mean, you really felt very strongly that, in fact, the heart and the wallet are connected, and that you are a man of the heart, and he obviously stated himself as a man of the head.
Right. Well, that was one of the differences that we had.
And how did that play
lives.
out over time?
I think he did a great job as chairman of the World Jewish Congress. So that was his gift to the Jewish world, and maybe to the world. That was a damn good one. I, on the other hand, I wanted to learn everything from the bottom up. He didn't. Let me give you an example. For instance, when we both went into the business, he had a desk in our father's office. I, on the other hand, started working in our distillery, learning how you make whiskey, and then as an accountant, and then as a salesman. I wanted to learn everything about the people in the business and how they reacted to a lot of stuff. He wanted to run the business. I wasn't that interested in running the business. I wanted to find out all about it if I could.
Your father, I think, wrote to you in a letter, the key to every man's future is himself. And you commented on that was not entirely correct. Do you remember your answer? If not, I can help you.
No, I think you better tell me.
Well, you said success also depends on luck, the society one is surrounded by, and factors beyond one's control. Can you explain that further?
Well, it's genes do one thing, DNA does one thing, and I think your environment and how you feel about yourself and whether you're willing to take risks or not is another thing. And I think that with me, I was a shy, again, not having very little ego kind of person, and then I got out of it. And that was who I was. I suddenly became, from being an inheritor, I became an entrepreneur and a change agent.
You said that when your father was ready to choose a successor, in fact, Edgar was the one who...
Oh, I always knew that. And Edgar and I discussed it one time. And he said, whatever happens, we can't win, because if we succeed, that'll be because Sam did it. And if we fail, it's because we're idiots. And which was true. And then he said, he wanted to move to New York. And I said, that's fine, I'll stay in Montreal. And he said, most of our business is in the United States, so therefore I'll probably be running the business. I said, have a good time. And I really meant that. I did not ever want to run a big business.
Well, your father, I think, also thought that you would be the one to burnish the family name.
Yes, and maybe that happened.
Well,
he was pretty correct. Man, he was, I tell you, I have three heroes. Moses is number one.
I interviewed him last night, by the way.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
I heard about the gala.
Yeah, it was, his agent was much more difficult than yours.
But the only problem was, he didn't speak very well. Was Aaron around?
No, but last night he spoke pretty well, except he continued to confuse Akkadian with Yiddish. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so...
Moses was my one hero. Churchill was my number two, and my dad was my number three. Because I thought he was a great visionary, that he really could put his hand on something and get right to the meat of it. No messing around. And I really thought he was quite something else. I thought he was a genius.
You talk about friendship a bit in terms of Leo Kolber, and then you talk about your brothers announcing, rather than taking into consideration your opinion, that his son would be his successor. And you talk about how there were decisions that were made in which you didn't fight back enough.
Right. I think that comes down to pecking orders. He was my older brother. He was big. He was strong. He had good marks in school, which I didn't really. He was my older and big brother. I was his little brother. And I think that relationship stayed much too long, and stayed during our business career.
You said old habits don't die, and talking about really just so honestly and poignantly reflecting on yourself and the times when you, even at the end, when you look back and you should have fought more than you did. Was that something that at this point in your life you regret, or do you feel that life played out correctly for you?
One night I had a wonderful dinner, Rita and I did, with Edgar's widow, Jan, who was a wonderful, wonderful woman. And I said, I really regret that Edgar and I didn't have the relationship we should have had. And she looked at me, she said, Charles, you should have no regrets. You should be very happy with what you've done and who you are. So no, I don't have regrets.
Yeah. And when, obviously, just to finish the business part of my questions, when Seagram was sold, it was tumultuous and a bit traumatic, I think, for the family. Your sense was, as you reflect on it, that businesses don't last for 4 generations. Was it fated to happen?
No, it was not fated to happen. It was a terrible, terrible mistake. Edgar told me later, and wrote in his last book, that he apologized to me, that he should have listened, and he didn't. And it was just a great tragedy, and not just for our family. It's a great tragedy for the employees, for the shareholders, and I think for the people who made the decision. It was just, I had a visit with Ed Willard, who was the chairman of DuPont at the time of the sale of our sale of DuPont. And he said, I don't know who the hell could think of such a stupid thing to do. There we are.
So let's move on to something that I know you felt very good about, which is the Montreal Expos, and your role. Firstly, I'm amazed. How did this happen? How did you get involved in baseball? I know you love baseball, but how did you get involved in it on a professional level?
Well, what happened was there was a round of expansion coming up in the National League, and the mayor of Montreal desperately wanted the Olympics. So he figured if he could have an excuse to have a stadium, then he could have his Olympics and he could blame it on baseball. I think that's what motivated him anyway. And at that time, he was very gung-ho, and he was a charismatic character. So he had me called by somebody. I was in Puerto Rico, I think, at a YPO conference. And this fellow said, he was the vice chairman of the executive committee, and he said, 10 people, $1 million each, and we'll have the franchise. So I said, okay, if you have a covered roof, we're in. And my wife said to me, that's it, just $1 million like that? I said, don't worry, it'll never happen. A couple of months later, I heard, on the news, 10 o'clock news, now we'll hear about the news and baseball in Montreal. And I looked at her and said, oh my God, we're in the glue. Welcome to Major League Baseball.
And how did the team change Montreal or change Canada?
Well, we were the first team outside the United States, and once again, I loved being, if you're an inheritor, to be able to be a pioneer in anything is just wonderful. And I had always wanted to do things for the public good. And I thought that this would be very good for the city. There's a great panache. New Yorkers wouldn't understand it, but there's a great panache in smaller cities to be, quote, major league. And this made Montreal major league. It made the province of Quebec major league. It made Canada major league. So it was a very good thing to do. And I also thought it would be a success because, as you mentioned, my brother and I used to go when we had a AAA franchise of the Brooklyn Dodgers. We would go and watch Sunday doubleheaders of 7 innings each. And it had good crowds. So I said, I think it'll sell. I think it'll be okay. And it was, and for 15 years we had a very good time. And then the last 7 were fraught with horrors. But, they always say when you have a sports team, I guess it's like if you have a yacht, and I don't have a yacht. The 2 best days are the day you buy it and the day you sell it. And that was certainly the case with me.
But along the way, I was fascinated. I mean, it was a small part of the story, as you told it in your book, but of your relationship with players, and also the way you were helping make decisions as to which players you wanted to have on the team. Was that part of the joy in it for you?
Oh, I think being friends or being acquaintances with the players, I never got too close to them because I thought that our professionals should handle all that sort of thing. And by the way, in those days, and I'm talking about the 70s and 80s, we didn't know that there was such a thing as cocaine. We didn't know that there are these other drugs that players are using. I mean, I was absolutely shocked when I found out about it. But, you know, maybe we were too naive, and maybe the other owners were too naive. We didn't know about those things. But being around the smell of the crowd, as it were, was one thing. But being in spring training, that was the best time.
So I asked you how the Expos changed Montreal. How did the Expos change you?
That was very important. I think that's when I came out of my shell and started taking responsibility for things publicly. Because I went from sort of a backroom guy to the front pages of the papers and on radio and television and so on. And handled myself, I must say, rather well, and could stand front and center as the chairman, not the CEO. I said, I don't know a damn thing about baseball. Frankly, I'd never played a game of baseball. And I said, we got great pros, let them run the team, and I'll do what I can on the PR end of life and in setting the tone for this club.
Were there times within your ownership that you realized you were emerging from that shell? Events?
Yeah, actually, pretty darned early. Because I think as anybody who's suddenly faced with the issue of being in the media, you learn pretty darn fast that you're either going to be good or you're not going to be good. And fortunately, I found I could do it, and I wasn't scared of the media. In fact, you know, in Canada, people were a lot more polite, so including the media. So the interviews are rather soft. I'll tell you a crazy story. There was a poor fellow who worked for one of the newspapers, and unfortunately, he was a gambler, and he owed some of the bad guys money, and I gave him some money. And I said, now don't pay me back, just do what you have to do. And then one day he wrote a really stinking article about me, and it had nothing to do with this, but he really clobbered me. And I said, okay, you're banned from interviews for the next 6 months. And that went around to all the other press guys, and that was the end of that. And everybody treated me with more respect because they knew I'd given them money, and they knew that that wasn't weighing on me, that I'd want the money back. And they thought that this guy was way out of line in what he wrote.
You know, I'm thinking that so much of what you did, as I read the book, and even now as I hear you speaking, was kind of prompted by intuition, rather than a rational, you know, logical system of, you know.
Well, as I said earlier, I went with my heart.
Well, and so I wonder how you're taking on the Expos, which was really for you just a matter of intuition and kind of an urging for you, how the rest of the family handled that or what they thought about it.
Well, the rest of the family was mainly my father. And he was watching me that summer, and he was saying, you know, where are you going? And I'd say, well, I have to see the mayor about this baseball thing. And he said, well, you get paid to sell whiskey. Yes, sir. One day I walked into his office, and I said, no matter what he says, I will not get angry, I will not leave the room, I won't do anything. And he used to like reading, at that time, the Daily News, New York Daily News. And he liked Dick Tracy, and he liked Little Orphan Annie. And that was his favorite. And Walter Winchell. Don't know if any of you remember Walter Winchell. I guess he was the page 6, but of the Daily News in those days. And he had the newspaper up in front of him. I said, Dad, I need to talk to you. And he said, put the paper down. He said, yeah, what about? I said, about baseball. Put the paper up in front of his face. And I said, well, it's about who's going to pay for it. Paper came down, and I said, well, I don't think that it'll make any money, so I don't think I should invite my sisters and my brother to join me in this. Oh? So he thought I was going to hit him up for a loan. I said, so I'll pay for it myself. Paper was really now flat down on the desk. And he looked at me, he said, you have that kind of money? I said, yes, barely. And then he picked out, I left the office, and he said, well, good luck. And he called Leo Kolber, who was running our family business, and asked Leo to dissuade me from doing this ridiculous thing. When the Expos happened, my father became the #1 fan in the world of the Montreal Expos. He wanted to know one thing. Did his son have the guts to go ahead and be a pioneer and try something and take that risk? Could he be a risk taker?
And you did.
And I did, and he was thrilled.
Yeah.
And of course, I was then thrilled if he was thrilled. Very simple.
Yeah. You know, it's actually, there's so much that's very poignant and touching in the book, and your relationship with your father, and in fact, within the dynamic and the orbit of your family is so interesting. But I want to move on to something that I know has become a chief love of yours, which is philanthropy. How, just in a general way, how has being involved in it both shaped you and your children?
Well, we learned, of course, that our parents need, my siblings and I. And, you know, some people, I guess, some kids get annoyed because their parents aren't with them enough and they're out doing philanthropy. I sort of didn't think that way, and my mother used to say that your father has 2 businesses. He has Seagram business, and he has Jew business. And he was a force in Canadian Jewry, and I followed in his footsteps, and I did all the right things in our federation and so on. And I remember one time, after he passed away, a delegation came to see me, and it was very strange. And it was sort of the king is dead, long live the king sort of thing. And yeah, I'd done all my things, and I was an officer of our federation and so on. And I said, you know, I don't even know if I like this thing. I've done it because I was supposed to do it. Come back in a year and let me think about it. And I must say, they were very kind. Nobody bothered me for a year. Then they came and asked me, and I said, look, let me tell you something. I will not walk in a dead man's shoes, and I will not compete with my father. If you'll take me for me, exactly who I am, I'd be very happy to serve. And they said yes, and I became president of our federation after a couple of years as chairman of the executive, and had a very enjoyable stint as chairman of the federation.
You said, and then I want to come back to your children, but you said that the two, you had a focus on Canada and a focus on the Jewish community. And in some ways those got combined. Can you give us some indication of the different projects you took on under those 2 rubrics?
Well, the first, in the Jewish community, we ran smack dab into a problem right at the beginning. And I was chairman of the health, I was an officer in charge of the health division, and all of a sudden the province of Quebec decided they were going to change the way health was being delivered, et cetera, et cetera.
Are you making any comment on the American state of healthcare?
No, thank you. Whatever you say, it's wrong. Anyway, the province of Quebec decided health care would be delivered in a different way, and the Jewish community was worried that there wouldn't be kashrut at the hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. I was not worried about that, and nor was the executive director of the federation. And I'll never forget the way presidents change in Montreal is the gavel is given from the retiring president or chairman to the next one in the middle of a meeting. Item 1 was the healthcare thing. And there were a lot of people who were in favor of telling the province to go to hell and going our own way. I was not one of those, and I said to myself, if you lose this fight, you're done. If you win the fight, you got a good chance to do well. We won the fight, we won the vote, which was taken that night, and we went on to do good. So that was my major thing in that. And then I also dabbled in Canadian Jewish politics.
Oh, that must have been fascinating.
Yeah, it was okay.
We won't talk about that. So I'm fascinated. You have such a, if we just looked at the numbers of charities that you've either started or been involved in, it's a long list. Among them, what are the things of which you're most proud?
Well, Peter, when my late wife and I started our foundation in 1985, we concentrated, having both been bad students, we concentrated on what one might call experiential education, and particularly with young people. And as was said by Madame Engel, it had to do with young people understanding their heritage. And we did that in Canada, and then, of course, came Birthright Israel. In Canada, though, in the 80s, if you'd ask a Canadian who he or she was, they would say, well, I'm not American, I'm not British, I'm not French. And then the interlocutor would say, well, that's very nice. Now, who are you? Well, I just told you. Well, they had no idea of what a Canadian or they were. And I've always believed, and I think we would all agree, that any decent society must have heroines, heroes, and myths. And the myths are important. Daniel Boone being a great example. And so we didn't have any of those in Canada. And there's a war we fought against the Americans, which is called the War of 1812. Now, none of you have ever heard of it. It was the one war we won. And during that war, by the way, the Americans burned down Toronto and the Canadians burned down Washington. And then they called it quits. They didn't realize that there were a whole bunch of immigrants who came to Canada, that there was the English-French thing, that there were pioneers in all kinds of things, the first woman doctor, the first teacher in a one-room schoolhouse, all that kind of the stuff that makes for a society. So we started doing 1-minute commercials, really, on some of these folks who had done things. By now, they're 80 minutes, and they're known far and wide in the country. They've been going on for 25 years, and eventually the program got too big for us, and we made it into a public foundation, which is called Historic of Canada, and it is fantastic. Well, so I'm very, very proud of that. And then, of course, there's Birthright.
Well, yeah, so let's talk about Birthright. Here's an idea that, how old is Birthright now?
Birthright's 16 years. 16
years is probably thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people have gone on and increasing. Well, how did the seed of that idea begin? How did you make it happen? How did you get the money for it? How does it continue?
Well, have you got 3-4 hours?
No, we'll give you 3 minutes.
Well, it started with the Israel Museum. And Judy Steinhardt was the chair of the American Friends of the Israel Museum. There was a museum party. We were at the museum party, and there was a fellow named Michael Steinhardt who said, Charles, I'd like to talk to you. And I said, fine. And we went out and we sat on the wall at the Israel Museum on the parapet. And he said to me, what do you think of Yossi Beilein's idea? Now, Yossi Beilin, who at that time was deputy treasurer or deputy foreign minister, he had this idea, and he spoke to me about it, spoke to Michael about it. He may have spoken to others. At all 17-year-olds in the world, of Jewish 17-year-olds, would get a voucher for a visit to Israel. And I remember asking him, well, where would you get the money? And he said, well, we'll take it from the Jewish Agency because they put it down the sewer anyway. And I remember saying to him, Yossi, that may or may not be true, but you know and I know that politically it ain't going to happen. So Michael asked me about this, and I said, he said, well, what do you think of the idea? I said, well, and he always reminds me of this, it's an audacious idea. He said, what do you think we can do about it? I said, well, it's a scheme to bankrupt the Jewish world, and it's too expensive. That was the beginning of our negotiation that night. So Birthright was given birth, if you want, at the Israel Museum that night. And then Yitz Greenberg, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, wonderful, wonderful man, as you all know, was the head of Michael's foundation. Jeff Solomon, God bless him, is the head of my foundation, still is. And the four of us negotiated. And we worked all winter, and then we got very lucky. There's a man who had been the Director General of the Israeli Department of Education, who thought that this was the most important idea he had heard, and he joined us as the CEO. And he was magnificent. And I think, I always say that without Shimshon, Birthright wouldn't be what it is. And his man who followed him, Giddy Mark, who was employee number one, has carried on brilliantly. And it just keeps on going and going and going. And this year, I think there'll be 48,000 young adults from around the world, 75% for North America, of which 65% of all the young adults who go will be American.
48,000
this year.
This year alone.
At the end of this year, there will be close to 600,000 who have been since 1999.
Yeah. And anybody,
it's incredible.
I'll add my.
And the great thing about it is, you know, Michael and I never tried to run anything. We were the cheerleaders in chief. And but it's been great to watch it grow. And yes, we've been around when there have been crises, which there are in every operation. But to watch it grow and become really part of Jewish life, part of the DNA now of our people, is really thrilling. It is so thrilling.
And it changes lives.
It changes. And you know, we get these letters, and that's what they say, every one of them. Changed my life, changed my life, changed my life.
So there's also the Charles Bronfman Prize. How did that start?
That was a huge surprise to me. It was my children. They're not exactly children anymore. You know, it's very tough calling somebody a child when they're in their 50s. But I must tell you all.
It's amazing how our kids grow up and we don't.
When I was in my 50s, my mother still called me her baby. So there we are. They suddenly told me that they were going to give me this prize. And it was going to be a prize for either people or a group under 50 who would use Jewish values to do something humanitarian for the world. And I thought that this idea of under 50, who the hell does anything under 50? So that was a little bit silly, but I said, well, I have to go along with it because it was one of the most brilliant things that's ever happened, because we've now had, I just called the person who won today. I can't say who it is because that's not allowed until June. But there are now 15 winners, and each one of them is just a superb human being. And what I like to do is trace what they did to win and then how they progressed from there. And every one of them goes up the ladder.
I mean, I know Ken Feinberg, I think, was the first. Jay Feinberg was the first.
Yeah. He's number one.
And amazing, I mean, in terms of what he has done in terms of donors and blood donors, and trying to get people to swab their cheeks just so they could be in the
life-saving business.
Huge, it's huge. And you say that your children also learned and are involved in their own way.
Oh yes, both of them. It's wonderful.
So I want to ask you, I think you're probably one of the most loving men I know, and I've tried to understand what are the qualities of the people with whom you fall in love. Is there anything common? I know how deeply in love with Rita you are, but you know, what is it that you love about people, and specifically, what qualities are there that are part of the people you do love?
Well, I think there's a softness, honesty, and having the same values I have. And when I've run into trouble is when people don't have those three fundamental areas. I mean, brightness, yes, everybody is bright who I meet. But it's not just intelligence. I have a saying that I've met an awful lot of people who are smart. I met very few who are wise. And so I guess I look for wisdom, somehow innate wisdom, and people who don't blow their own horns. I don't like that. I don't like people to be bragging about what they do and how smart they are and that sort of thing.
So are you content
Yes, sir.
now?
I am. I think I write that in the book.
So,
I say I'm a happy man.
so what is it that makes you happy? And if you look back, and let's reverse the question. What are the things that are disappointments in your life? What are the things that make you happy in life?
Well, I had many disappointments. Disappointment of my youth, a disappointment of my studies. I couldn't even be much with girls. I was too scared. I was very shy. In fact, I didn't know what to say at a dinner party until I had the Expos, and then I could talk about baseball. Strange but true. Those are, and of course the Seagram thing, and the relationship with my brother, which was partly my fault, partly his fault, and I don't think we should get into that. The bright spots were the Expos and philanthropy. I think I found my métier in philanthropy, and I'm very happy that I was a businessman going into philanthropy and not retired. We decided to become a proactive foundation, and what we did to measure our success or lack thereof was to measure everything. And a lot of people say you can't measure philanthropy. I don't agree. What you can do is you set your goals. What in the instance, first in the 92Y, I'm still, sorry, I still call it the 92nd Street Y. 92Y.
We'll take it either way.
I am sure there are profits and losses of every department, and everything is measured. And it's the same thing with anything we invest in for philanthropy. We set goals.
And as you look forward to your future, which we hope will be a very long time, what are the goals you set for yourself now?
Well, first of all, to smell the roses.
You mean to slow down?
To slow down. Secondly, I'm very involved now with the Israel Policy Forum, because I firmly believe that...
Why don't you tell our people what
Israel
that is?
Policy Forum has one goal, and that's the two-state solution. And whether it's popular or not popular, those of us who are involved with it, we know, whether we're right or wrong, we know that the only way Israel will survive is with two states, their state and a Palestinian state. Some in this room will not agree with that, fine. But that's what we believe, and I will be very involved with that. I'll always be involved with Birthright, and my family, Rita's family.
How many grandchildren do you have now? All in?
All in is 12. No, 11 and a half. 11 and a half.
One's on the way?
One's on the way.
And you write handwritten notes on their birthdays? You remember all their birthdays?
My assistant remembers everybody's birthday, including mine. I don't even know that one.
So one of your successes is having a great assistant.
Absolutely.
As one thinks about the Israel Policy Forum and the future of Israel, are there any? You also are involved with this group of commanders who have come together to talk
Yes.
about security in Israel. Are they being listened to? Well, let's say what they are first.
Well, this is a group of 270 former generals and equivalents in the Mossad, in the Shin Bet, and in the police. And these are people who have come up with a security plan that does not require anybody else, does not require the Palestinians to agree or disagree, does not move any settlers, but it provides a secure Israel. One person I know who agrees totally with their premise is Ehud Barak, and we believe that you can't do any arrangement that the Israelis will go for without airtight security. and we believe that these folks have come up with it. They certainly believe in it. And, 270 generals is rather a lot to agree on one thing.
I'm not going to ask you to answer this question directly unless you want to, and then we'll take note if you don't, which is, do you think that American policy towards Israel is in the right direction?
Oh, well, I have a guru about Israel and the United States. Somebody asked Tom Friedman, who's my guru, about which of two candidates would be the best president for Israel. And his answer, and I have to say that answer, is the best president for the United States will be the best president for Israel. Mm-hmm. And I firmly believe that. Because the United States, without its leadership, the world is in trouble, and certainly without its leadership, the Middle East is in more turmoil than it absolutely has to be, which is a lot. And without its leadership, Israel would be in a lot of trouble.
So we'll wait for someone to ask you off screen as to whether we have the right president for Israel. No, I'm not going to ask you.
We always hope that the president of the United States will be strong and fair and fine.
Good answer. So I have a few questions for you. So what is your most cherished memory from the castle, quote, the castle on Peel? And now I'll give you something to think about. This is from a former employee who worked there from 1978 to 1980.
That's not a long stint.
Well, whoever it was there.
Well, actually, we used to have office Christmas parties, or I guess we call it holiday parties. In those days, it was still Christmas parties. And my father would have the chef. He loved food. He'd have the chef from our LaSalle distillery come in and provide for everybody in the office a whole dinner and turkey and no ham, thank you very much. But we had turkey and we had great food, and there would be drinks and partying. I think there were some carryings on, which I, of course, didn't know about, but it was a heck of a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. And I thought that, in my innocent way, that it was very good for the repartee and the ambience in the company. Whether it was or not, I don't know, but I enjoyed it.
Mm. I read, your book talks about how you had the boys and the girls were in a certain way separated, and there was family time, but not so much family time. If you could take one lesson away in terms of raising children that you may have taken from your youth, what would it be?
Well, of course, I was raised in an age of little children should be seen and not heard. And there was no way in that generation, parents were pretty aloof from children. Then in my generation, we were a little bit closer to children. In today's generation, what I think is wonderful is that parents really spend a lot of time with their kids, both in serious time and playtime, and are devoted to their families. Now, whether that stops this generation's kids from being on the psychiatrist's couch, I don't know. So I think also in every generation, you do whatever your parents did, you're going to do something else. So that's the way life goes. I can't think of any particular thing that I recall as being something I gave to my kids. But you get brought up in a certain way, and there are certain principles that you have to have. And I often think that it depends on who the child is. I know that my son and my daughter were raised differently because they were very different kids.
In terms of advice, there's a question, what advice would you give to young philanthropists today?
Take it seriously and focus. Again, if you want to give to this institution, 92Y, don't just give to the institution. Pick out an area that you want to support, and then support it. Go on the board or the committee or whatever it is. Get involved personally with that, because I think giving to amorphous institutions, which we all do, we'll all give to UJA Federation, but to pick out things that really get you in the heart, and you can translate that into making inroads, doing it better. I think that's very rewarding.
Yeah, I would have a follow-up question to that in terms of, do you think it's correct for people to withhold from institutions if, in fact, there is one part of what that institution is doing that they don't like?
No, I think you go in another part of that institution that you do like.
So you just continue, you just kind of direct your money?
Yeah, I think we should all direct our money.
So there's and again, matter of advice, and I recall that when you were talking about the Expos, you talked about the panache of having a major league team, and I was thinking, well, you know, we have 2 baseball teams in the city. I don't know if there's much panache in it right now, but this question actually deals with that. What would you do specifically to turn around the New York Mets?
You know, I happen to be a Mets fan, and I think Fred Wilpon is a super person, and he's a personal friend. But oh boy, oh boy, I think that it's too early to declare the season over. But what they're going to have to do probably at one stage of the game this summer is to call up some kids and see how they develop. They just got a big problem.
So one last question, and then we're going to bring this to a conclusion. And really, I will urge everybody to go read this incredible book called Distilled. Is probably one of the, as I said, one of the most riveting and honest memoirs I've ever read, and it's so indicative of who you are. But Charles, if you had a primary principle in your life, a principle by which that you use to make decisions both existential and practical, what would it be?
I think it's a combination of practicality and honesty. Because to live in dreamland doesn't do any good for anybody. And to kid yourself also doesn't do it. So you got to be honest with yourself, honest with the people that you're dealing with, and you have to be practical at the same time. I hope that's the way I work.
Well, again, I would tell everybody that Charles will be signing books afterward, and I hope you all get the chance to do it. Meanwhile, Charles, I am so personally, and I think organization on behalf of the 92nd Street Way, so grateful.
You just said it, 92nd Street Way.
Well,
Gotcha.
I am one of the unconverted. You know, you talk about being ingrained from childhood. It just says how long we've had a history with this organization, which is a very good thing. But really, I am just so grateful on behalf of all of us that you gave time to answer these questions. As one who adores you deeply, I look forward to many more years of you doing good work in this world, in this community, and I honor you for all that. So on behalf of everybody, thank you very much.